programs that Frank was one of the early presenters, and he did a presentation on design, construction, and maintenance of antennas. And for the longest time, that stood as the high water mark for the number of people that attended a presentation. And if you've ever had a chance to listen to Frank at Contest University or anywhere else, or as you'll see tonight, there's a reason that the crowds were so big. So one other thing I want to mention before we hand it over to Frank is we will take questions. You can submit those at any time. There's a little question box. Just put your question in there. If you are a licensed amateur, appreciate it if you gave us your call. Put that at the end, and then just hit send. But we will hold them until the end of the presentation, and then we'll give Frank a chance to respond to those. But you're welcome to submit the questions at any time. So I think that takes care of all the administrative stuff. Let's go ahead and get started. Frank, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, Ken, thank you. Maybe someday you'll get an opportunity to come back and operate at a W3LVL station, huh?
I hope so.
Very good. Well, this presentation is about the beginnings of contesting. There was no such thing as contesting before World War I. Some have argued that, well, the ARRL sponsored membership or subscription contest to CQ or to QST, but there was no on-the-air contesting. It didn't exist. And the concept came about after World War I, when hams got back on the air. Amateur radio was off the air in the United States from April 1917 until November 1919. And soon, by 1921, when these tests took place, there were more than 10,000 licensed radio amateurs in the United States. So the hobby was growing very fast. And soon the interest in crossing the Atlantic got to be very strong. Many hams were involved in the gigantic radio stations that were built by Marconi and others before World War I. These were megawatt transmitters with massive antennas that were used across the Atlantic. And then during the war and some of the desperate attempts to communicate between Washington, D.C. and our troops in Europe, which also involved massive radio stations. So when the hams got back on the air, they wanted to try to do the same thing. But obviously it couldn't be done with the long-wave technologies of Marconi with million-dollar installations. So when the hams were relegated to 200 meters and down, which happened as soon as they went back on the air in 1919, most of the commercial interests thought that 200 meters and down was useless spectrum, of absolutely no value to anyone. But when the hams got on the air, they started to discover that, particularly at night, that they could communicate over fairly long distances. Not as long as transatlantic, but in any case, in 1920, a magazine probably none of you have ever heard of, unless you've heard me give this presentation before, a magazine called Everyday Engineering Magazine, in their September 1920 edition, announced the first transatlantic test. And this test was very much a contest. But let me just mention a little bit about Everyday Engineering Magazine. This magazine dealt with all kinds of aspects of mechanics and electrical engineering. It was a popular magazine, maybe similar to Popular Mechanics of the modern era. And it had a section dealing with radio, which was a rapidly growing hobby. So this is copied from the pages of Everyday Engineering Magazine in September 1920. And you can see the rules. This contest that they established was for the purpose of establishing communication across the Atlantic, and they proposed to make all the arrangements for successful tests. So during the upcoming winter, they say the next transatlantic conquest will be recorded, and that is transmission from a 200 meter, that's about 1.5, at that time it would have been kilocycles. We would call it 1.5, 1,500 kilocycles. We would call it 1,500 kilohertz. 1 kilowatt experimental station to transmit to England. Well, when they said an experimental radio station with that power, what they had in mind was spark. But we'll see that there was a little bit of flaw to that thinking. The test would begin on February 1st, 1921. And notice in that little red box right there, they definitely call this a contest, a radio contest. And this is the very first reference to a radio contest that appears in any text anywhere. And they also referred to this being what we would call a single operator contest, any man, or any group of men. So we would call this a multi-operator contest. So any man or any group of men can enter. And they had an idea as to that the credit would be given to the engineers who designed and built the station as well as to the operators, and they also talk about companies that might help. And further details in September 1920, Everyday Engineering, that you had to make arrangements in advance to enter this contest so that they could be allotted spaces in a schedule. The thought was that all the different entrants would be given a time frame in which they could transmit so that interference wasn't hopeless. They were expected all the transmitters to be spark, so they're very wideband transmitters, and the interference would be just terrible if they didn't have some sort of an arrangement. So they, towards the end of the year, started putting together a schedule a few months before the tests, and you notice there were also prizes to be awarded. Manufacturers were solicited so that there would be substantial prizes to be awarded to those that successfully crossed the Atlantic. And can you enter the competition? Yes. The idea was that anyone who had proven ability to communicate over long distances would be allowed to participate. And even some hams with limited facilities would be allowed to participate as well. But then a hitch developed. Now notice now we've switched from Everyday Engineering magazine to a very brief sentence that appeared in February 1921 QST, the month of the first transatlantic test. And it says that Everyday Engineering, very unfortunately, has been obliged to suspend publication. And its editor, the man who developed this idea of a radio contest, has asked the ARRL to take over the tests and see them through. Well, it's said that the ARRL agreed to take this on reluctantly. And they were asked at the very last minute to do it, but they did ultimately agree. And then the next thing you see in QST, unfortunately, is this. May 1921. First transatlantic test was a failure. It was kind of an unbelievable failure, as a matter of fact. All of the hams who participated in the test were given a message that they were expected to send, so that the British hams who were on the receiving end would send in their logs of what they received to the judge for the contest, and then the judge would score the logs to determine who won. Well, the British judge reported that after careful log checking, not even one UK entrant received even a single word that can be unquestionably attributed to an American amateur's message. So not only was it a failure, it was a total failure. About 24 hams in the United States transmitted these prearranged messages, and about 250 British hams, or as they call them, amateurs. The term ham was kind of foreign to the British. Listened, and kind of the postscript to this failed transatlantic test said that all of the receivers that we used in Britain were regenerative receivers, and the receivers were jamming each other. The early regenerative receivers had serious problems with radiation. And furthermore, harmonics from big, powerful transmitters on the low frequency end were causing problems, as well as electrical RFI, the same problem we have today, and for poor frequency calibration. So a whole series of problems. But perhaps the biggest problems were that essentially all of the transmitters in the United States were spark transmitters, and everyone was assigned a rather short transmitting period. So the second transatlantic test attempted to deal with this. I'll make one comment. This radio contest was a lot different than anything we do because it was one way. All of the transmitting took place in the United States, and all of the receiving took place in the UK, and some other hams in Europe also participated, but it was primarily the UK. But at the time, the regulations were such that American radio amateurs were allowed to run 1 kilowatt power, but in Europe, the power restrictions were just a few watts. So everyone realized you couldn't possibly have a successful two-way QSO given the extreme power limitations in Europe. So the contests were set up as one-way, transmitting from the United States and receiving in Europe. So you'll notice an interesting little quote here in the first paragraph. So in QST, there was some commentary about why these tests failed. And it referred to the American dyed-in-the-wool ham who has learned how to get amateur DX only after years of patient struggle. Well, this term ham was kind of unknown among British amateurs. And furthermore, in QST, they went on to comment in May 1921 QST that most of the circuits used by the Britishers were inferior to our standard American regenerative receivers. So as you might imagine, this commentary wasn't received particularly well when QST magazine was read by the British radio amateurs. And then the May QST goes on. Doesn't stop that. It says in the review of the failed test, the first transatlantic test, that we would bet our new spring hat that if a good U.S. amateur with such a set, and they're speaking about a regenerative receiver, and an Armstrong Super, which is a super heterodyne receiver, invented by Armstrong during World War II. I'm sorry, during World War I. If such a good U.S. amateur with American equipment could be sent to England, then reception of U.S. amateurs would straight away become commonplace. And this statement in that first paragraph on this page was reproduced in the English Wireless World magazine, and as you might imagine, it caused considerable commotion. So, if you go to ARRL headquarters, in their attic is a hat. It's the spring hat. And a Mr. Burnham of the firm Burnham & Company, a prominent British manufacturer of radio apparatus, took the league up on their bet of a new spring hat, and he bet that Godley, you'll learn about Godley in a little bit, would hear no American amateur signals. So now we have a real sporting game here. A little of a failure of the first test, blame laid for some of the reasons it failed, perhaps some disparaging remarks about some of the participants in the contest, and now this spring hat. So at the first national convention of the ARRL in the summer of 1921, plans were laid for a second transatlantic test. And this is the test we all have heard about. December 1921 QST announced this test, and this is the cover of that magazine. The initial announcement, very brief announcement, appeared in July QST, and the detailed rules appeared in October QST. And by the way, these QSTs are available online on the ARRL homepage. Just click on QST, and then you can search back through these 1921 issues and the 1922 results if you're so interested. Well, this cartoon was published in December 1921 QST, and if you take a look at this cartoon, it's kind of a cartoon of how a more modern station was set up. And you notice the ham on the left there is Bill, and it wasn't Bill involved in this, but anyway, Bill, give her the limit. We've got to win this contest. And the transmitter shown here was probably the most modern tubes available at that time, 250-watt power tubes, similar to maybe the 250TH of the 1930s. And notice the comment on the upper right-hand corner, "Good night, I'm going to get out here before the whole place blows up." Well, earlier I mentioned the name Godley, and the intent of the ARRL to send an expert ham to the UK to assure that the success of these tests. The idea wasn't to suggest that the British amateurs wouldn't be successful in the second running, but rather to provide another participant from the United States with some of the best equipment and skills available to kind of supplement the effort. So who was this man? He was represented by the ARRL to be America's most expert operator in the practical reception of shortwave signals. He was a former ARRL director, a member of the Radio Club of America, and the Institute of Radio Engineers, what we now call the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the IEEE. He was unanimously chosen by the ARRL Board of Directors at the first ARRL National Convention in Chicago to represent the League in this first DXpedition. Some comment about Paul: he was referred to as one of the hardiest of the hard-boiled hams, with a brand new bag of tricks. A man used to twirling a variometer all night long. Well, the Radio Club of America, of whom Paul was a distinguished member, had a dinner in New York for him just before he departed for England on November 15th. And Godley's parting words to his friends in the Radio Club of America upon embarking on the ship heading to England was, "Please build a station that will get over there." Because he didn't want to fail either. And of course he knew this spring hat was on the table, so he wanted to succeed. And this plea to please build a station that will get over here did not fall on deaf ears. And the Radio Club of America took this very seriously to assure that Paul Godley would succeed. So now we go back to that photograph that was on the first page. So this is the location of the first DXpedition. It's on a place called Montfode Farm. And if you're interested, if you go to Google and search for Montfode Farm, M-O-N-T-F-O-D-E, you'll find a little bit about it. It's a housing development now. But back in 1921, it was a farm field covered in seaweed, which was the popular fertilizer to use on a farm field. This rented tent that you see in the left-hand side of the image here is located one beverage antenna length away from the sea. You can see the sea in the not very distant, not very far away. So this tent was the home for Paul Godley for 10 bitter, cold, rainy nights in December, from the starting on the 7th of December and then running for 10 nights. They QRT'd on the 16th of December. And I'll just jump ahead quickly. It was successful. They heard 18 CW stations and 9 Spark stations. And 8 British stations heard 11 U.S. hams as well. So the British were also very successful. And U.S. hams were also heard in the Netherlands and France and Germany. If you look in this photograph, you'll see a building here. This is a nursing home, and it's still here today. If you go to Scotland, that's the Abbotsford Nursing Home, Abbotsford. And if you look on Google, you can learn about that. It still operates as Abbotsford Nursing Home. Well, this second transatlantic test took place almost exactly 20 years after Marconi received the letter S in his transatlantic test from Cornwall to St. John's, Newfoundland, on the 12th of December, 1901. And one of the lessons learned from that was they wanted to have an international observer to assure that these signals being heard from North America were legitimate. And the man shown in this photograph is Inspector Pearson. He worked for the Marconi Company. He was one of their expert operators, and he witnessed everything that was heard in this freezing cold tent on those 10 nights in December. Well, when Godley got on the ship going to England, he met another prominent member of the Radio Club of America, Harold H. Beveridge. And this was an unexpected meeting on the ship. And as you might imagine, Godley learned a great deal about the Beveridge antenna on that ship. And the Beveridge antenna is the one that was used. Harold Beveridge at that time was the leading radio receiving engineer for the Radio Corporation of America. And here's an image of his receiving antenna heading towards the beach in Ardrossan, Scotland, a 1,300-foot Beveridge, about 12 feet high. Now, interestingly, radio amateurs today who are interested in low-frequency operations are very, very familiar with the Beveridge antenna. And it was a very successful part of this test, but it fell into disuse really until about the 1960s when Ernie, K1PPW, resurrected the antenna. So Godley took 2 receivers to the UK. One was a super heterodyne designed by Armstrong. And can you imagine trying to operate this receiver? It had 13 controls. Count those knobs, 13 of them to set up this receiver. And this is a view looking inside the receiver. It's kind of the classic construction technique of that day. And you might wonder, given the success of the transatlantic test, did hams start using superhets? Well, not really. Receivers were typically battery operated in those days, and when you had 9 vacuum tubes in the receiver, it required a terrible investment in batteries. So superhets didn't kick in for quite some years to come. Hams were quite happy with their regenerative receivers. This is a schematic of the Armstrong superhet receiver and the Beveridge antenna that were used in Ardrossan. If you look on the left side, you can see in the schematic the wire with a 200 to 400 ohm termination resistor. And the only tuned circuit in this entire receiver is right here between the Beveridge antenna and the detector. Had a 5-stage IF amplifier, untuned, operated at about 100 kilohertz. And a beat frequency oscillator, we all recognize that in modern receivers, in the lower right-hand corner. Well, you might recall the plea that Godley made to build a station that I can hear. So the 6 members of the Radio Club of America took on the task to build a multi-operator station to participate in this contest. And it was decided to build it in Greenwich, Connecticut at property owned by 1BCG. At the time, radio amateurs had call signs that didn't begin with a letter. They began with a number. And Milton Cronkite. And this photograph is looking east. You can see the antenna that they put up in November. Freezing conditions. Notice the ground is snow-covered. The shack in this image is located directly under the vertical part of this antenna. Construction began on about the 19th of November, and the antenna was the first thing to be complete. The chief engineer for the construction of this station was Edwin Armstrong himself, who's known for receiving antennas, but he's a very capable engineer, and he took on this construction with 5 very capable helpers to build this 1BCG station. Perhaps Armstrong's most famous early accomplishment was the application of the early Audion tubes developed by DeForest, and the application of those tubes to radio frequencies. And of course, he was the inventor of the super regenerative receiver and the inventor of the super heterodyne receiver that God with him. And he was also the first recipient of the IRE medal in 1917, before he went off to Europe during the war. So here's the ham shack that was used in this 1BCG station. It's a 10 by 14 hut. And in this hut would be a 1 kilowatt transmitter and 6 operators. 2,000 volts. It was breadboard construction, so you can imagine on these 10 freezing cold nights in Connecticut that these operators had to be mighty careful to not get tripped up in this transmitter, but they were highly motivated to stay in the building because it was the only source of heat. Here's a photograph of the antenna that was used at 1BCG. This would be a fabulous antenna today. It's a T-vertical antenna, 100 feet across on the top. The vertical down lead is 70 feet long, constructed of 8 wires, 18 inches in diameter. And here's a schematic of that antenna. It's sat over a elevated counterpoise with 30 radials, and you can see in the schematic the shack sitting right below the center of the antenna. And here's a schematic view of the counterpoise. It had 30 60-foot wires, and it was about 12 feet high. I'm sorry, about 8 feet high. So it was not a radial system as we would refer to it today. It was an untuned counterpoise that had a lot of capacitance to ground. And here's a photograph looking at the transmitter that was built on the site. Most of the work on the transmitter was completed on the initial version of the transmitter was completed at the end of November, but it was rebuilt several times. Originally, it was built as a self-oscillating amplifier. It didn't have a separate oscillator as we would use today. So and that was the kind of transmitter that was commonly used. It was referred to as a self-exciting oscillator. And that kind of a transmitter had a serious problem, and that is any movement at all of the antenna would cause the frequency of the transmitted signal to vary significantly. Signals were very unstable. And they had this problem and decided to completely rebuild the transmitter, and I'll show you the diagram of that in a moment, into what was then called a MOPA transmitter, a master oscillator power amplifier. I'll show you the schematic in just a moment. Now in this photograph, there's a keying relay shown here right in the middle of the table. That keyed the oscillator as well as the amplifier. There are 4 vacuum tubes shown here. These are 250 watt tubes. 1 is used as an oscillator, 3 as amplifiers. And notice this is all open, 2,000 volts of DC here on a portable table, and there are 6 men in this 10 by 14 room all night long for 10 days. This is the tube they used. It's the UV204, which was a fairly new tube at the time. It was about $50. It was rated at 2,000 volts, and at 1 BCG, they operated it at 4,500 volts. Here's a schematic of the transmitter. According to the official documentation of the Radio Club of America, this transmitter was operated at 990 watts input. The FCC regulations limited power to 1 kilowatt input power. Its output power was about 550 watts. In order to have as stable a signal as possible, the keying relay keyed the oscillator, this master oscillator here, and there's one of the contacts here, and just shorted a coil on and off to change the frequency of the oscillator. So the oscillator ran continuously, but one of the contacts on the keying relays changed the frequency of the oscillator, so it was actually FSK. And when the oscillator was off frequency, they also keyed the amplifier off with this other contact. And this circuit, in the parlance of that day, was called a grid leak. So it basically biased the amplifier off. So they would shift the frequency of the continuous running oscillator and turn the amplifier on and off with keying. Well, they had receivers in this 10 by 14 foot hut also, and they were used to monitor the transmitted signal as well as to monitor reports on long wave of the success of Godley in Scotland. And on this table is the key that was used to key the transmitter, located just below the speaker on the right side of the table. Right here is the key. So the operator, I guess, sat here somewhere and keyed the transmitter with that key. Well, the test was a big success. This was the message that was received. This message was received on the first time that it was sent from 1 BCG in Connecticut to Godley in Scotland. It was received at 0300 Zulu on December 12th, and it simply says number 1 from 1 BCG. W refers to the number of wards. W equals 12. New York, dated on the 21st of December, to Paul Godley in Anderson, Scotland. Congratulations is the text, and it's signed by the 6 men who built the built the 1 BCG station. So that's the historic message right there. The reports from Scotland were sent back to the United States by commercial radio using the huge Marconi transmitter located on Sefton Mountain in Wales, 250 kilowatt long wave station. You can see the big tall towers used here. For administrative reasons in the way that the Marconi company operated, the messages from Godley describing his results were not transmitted until 24 hours later. So the messages received in the hut in Connecticut were actually about the results from the day before, not from that night's operation, but rather from the previous day. So, and that was just administrative handling of messages by the Marconi company. Well, of course, a day after they sent this message number 1 on the 12th of December. They received word back through the Marconi company that the message had been successfully received. And I think you can tell from the look of the 6 men who built and operated this station that they were well pleased with the results that they had achieved. And the names of the 6 men are shown here. Armstrong was the chief engineer. On the left, Johnny Grinan was the chief operator. He is the operator who did send the message that was successfully received in Scotland. On the right side is Minton Cronkite. He was the owner of the property where the station was built. And this is the cover of January 1922 QST. I think it's rather self-explanatory. Looks like the printer found plenty of exclamation points to put on the QST that month. This was a huge breakthrough. But notice the very large number of CW stations that got across compared to the number of Spark stations. And then one of those Spark stations was never successfully identified. One AAW, who's shown here, was not on the air. So it's never been determined who this was. But someone apparently appropriated the call 1 AAW during the contest. I'm sure that's happened in contests since then also. Some of these stations are pretty well known. 1XM, that is the club station at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. 1YK, which was also heard. That's the club station at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. That's now W1YK. 2EH was the station at RCA Riverhead. And 2BML was Harold Beveridge of Beveridge Antenna fame, also in Riverhead, New York. Well, the significance of this accomplishment was very widely publicized after this event. This is the cover of Scientific American magazine, and kind of a romanticized picture of what the situation looked like with those 6 men in that 10 by 14 hut and the 250-watt tubes glowing brightly there. There they show Armstrong looking up at the antenna tuner on the roof of the hut. And in subsequent years, there have been several commemorations. This stone was placed by the Radio Club of America 200 feet from the site of the 1BCG transmitter. This stone is still present. It's located in Greenwich, Connecticut, at the intersection of Clapboard Road and North Street. And this stone is engraved, and it says, near this spot on December 11th, 1921, radio station 1BCG sent to Anderson, Scotland, the first message ever to span the Atlantic on short waves. 1BCG, an amateur station, was built and operated by members of the Radio Club of America, dedicated 1950. Some years later, the Radio Society of Great Britain placed a commemorative plaque near the grounds of the nursing home where Godley set up his rented tent. And I won't read the text here, but it commemorates the reception in December 1921 of the signals from Greenwich, Connecticut to Anderson, Scotland. And you can see this plaque today if you're in Scotland at the Abbotsford Nursing Home on the waterfront in Anderson, Scotland. The actual location where the tent was located is now a housing development. So that's the last slide. Ken, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, Frank, very good. Good stuff. All right, if you have any questions, now's the time to shoot those over to us. I had a couple of comments along the way, people enjoying the presentation, Frank. So we'll just pause for a minute here and see if there's any questions. I should also mention, and most of you probably know this already, that we are recording Frank's presentation, and that will get posted to the Worldwide Radio Operators Foundation webpage, www.wwrof.org, and I'll have that up here in a little bit. So, okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions. Frank, you covered it all, and it's okay. Here we go. Ted, WA3AER was wondering what was the next step. Was there anything, any sort of contest or anything that followed this that you know of?
Hello, Ted. You're a PVRC member that I know well. Well, things developed very quickly after this, but not so much in terms of top band. If you recall, the very first slide of this referred to modern top band DXing. Well, the hams quickly migrated to much higher frequencies, or as they would say at the time, much shorter wavelengths. It was quickly discovered that that you didn't need acres of land for a transmitting antenna like that vertical I showed you, or a 1,300-foot long beverage. That as you QSY'd up to the 40-meter band and the 20-meter band, and before very many years went by, the 10-meter band, that you could communicate with a few feet of wire. So I think the big thing that happened was the transition to higher frequencies. But then radio contesting took off in the latter part of the 1920s with the beginnings of what we now call the sweepstakes contest and then DX contest. So it wasn't very many years. But top band contesting, well, top band DXing didn't really get going again until the 1960s because during World War II, Loran pretty much took that band over, and except for a few really hard-boiled hams such as W1BB, there was very, very little DXing going on top band until the 1960s when Loran was shut down. Ken?
Okay. Here's a question from Carl, K9LA. Fascinating topic, and great job, Frank. Any idea on the signal strength comparisons between Spark and CW?
Hi, Ken. Well, I think just looking at the number of Spark stations heard versus the number of CW, I think the copy was much more reliable with the CW stations. And I didn't mention, but 2 of those CW stations were running less than 50 watts. So I think that'll give you a good idea. The Spark stations were probably running around the kilowatt level, and 2 of those CW stations were running just 50 watts. So that'll give you a pretty good clue as to the answer. But I don't specifically know. There were probably no S meters at the time. In fact, I'm sure there were none. Ken?
Okay, question from Chip. Do you know if the propagation sunspot cycle had any effect? Would they have been able to do this earlier, 5, 10 years later? Any idea where they were in the sunspot cycle?
I don't know where it was, Chip, but I'm sure you can find that out easily. But as I mentioned, the thing that really happened after this is the rapid transition to higher frequencies. So what we would call top band today was pretty much abandoned by hams shortly after this test took place, and it became the province of kind of local communications, and the DXers were up on 40 and 20 meters. Yeah?
Okay, Mike, VE9AA, great presentation. Do you know when the first two-way was made on 200 meters?
It happened very shortly thereafter. In fact, even before the transatlantic test took place, there were some successful two-way communications between the east coast of the United States and California. But it was just about a year later when two-way communication was first established between the U.S. and France. And again, if you go back, if you go to the NRRL homepage and look in QST, you'll find some very interesting documentation of some of these early two-way QSOs that took place. But it blossomed from this first successful test and then the fairly rapid QSY to higher frequencies, and then one successful QSO followed by dozens and then hundreds of more just a few months later. Ken?
Okay. John, KC0BMF, other than the wire cage antenna, do you know of any other antenna types that might have been used by the other stations?
No, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect some of that is documented in the 1922 QSTs. Ken?
Okay, we'll just add this one other comment and then wrap it up. Comes from Bill, VE4 Kilo Zulu. So might be interested to know that the Ontario Spark Station 3BP was operated by Ted Rogers Sr., who later went on to success in Ontario, building broadcast receivers as well as owning broadcast stations. His son, Ted Jr., created Rogers Communications Incorporated of CATV, satellite, and cellular telephone fame. And fortune, of course. So.
That's a very interesting story.
There you go.
I didn't know that. Yeah, he's the only non-American in the list of stations that were heard. He was one of the Spark stations that was heard. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I am going to grab the presentation roll here back real quick, folks. I just want to put up one quick slide, and let me get to the next page. Okay, well, Frank, first off, thanks a bunch for joining us this evening, and great presentation. You know, we do a lot of topics here, and some of them get kind of technical or are a little more, I don't know, you call it serious or whatever. This is one where you can just put your feet up and sit back and really enjoy it. A lot of fun stuff and informative as well. So thank you for taking the time to put that together for us. Couple more events coming up here. The next one is Sunday, March 24th with Randy Thompson, K5ZD, looking at the WPX contest coming up. And also on Tuesday, April 16th, Carl, K9LA, will have one on solar topics. What I would encourage you to do is to go to the WWROF webpage listed at the bottom there and click on the webinars link. And that's where all the recorded webinars are. And we have a list of all the upcoming presentations. Carl's has not been posted yet, so if you're looking for that, just sit tight. It will be up there shortly. But we've got a couple others following Carl's as well in April, and those are posted there. So go ahead and take a look. Pass the word around if you would. Let everyone know about the program, and also while you're on the foundation webpage, just take a look around at the work they do and things they're doing to support amateur radio and amateur radio contesting. So with that, Frank, anything else you want to add? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
No, that's it, Ken. Thanks for organizing this.
Okay, very good. All right, well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great evening or day wherever you're at, and we'll see you on the 24th, I hope, for the next event. Take care. So long. Bye-bye.